All right, welcome everybody. My name is Johannes Urpelainen and I'm the director of the Energy Resources and Environment Program. And today I'm very happy to welcome and introduce Robert Gurman, who's an alum of our ERE program from well before my time. I joined just a year ago the program. And Robert is with Pro Energy Consulting LLC. He's got very extensive experience with all kinds of energy finance, project development, you name it, he's done it. And in fact, he has also taught a class here at SAIS on project finance. We were just discussing about the possibility of maybe bringing that class back to the school in the future. So I'm not gonna take any more of our valuable time. I'm just gonna let Robert tell us a little bit about the US offshore wind outlook, and then we'll open it for discussion.
Great.
The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Johannes. Good afternoon. Hi, everybody. I'm Robert Gurman. I am very happy to be here. As Johannes mentioned, I'm an alum of both SAIS and the Bologna Center. In fact, there's a big Bologna Center, Amici, the Bologna reunion at the United Nations tomorrow in New York City. So this coincidentally is a real SAIS Bologna Center weekend for me, so I'm very happy. As Johannes mentioned, I was an adjunct professor in international economics in the ERE program. I taught for several years here an international project finance course. And I myself have about 30 years of professional experience in international infrastructure development and finance. I've done a lot of very different things, a lot of very interesting things, and very much enjoy teaching and being able to communicate my experience and my observations on the infrastructure development. By the way, I will speak for 30 or so minutes, but please, questions, interrupt me at any time. We can go back and forth. We don't have to stand on ceremony here. So the title today is U.S. Offshore Wind Ready for Takeoff. And the reason why there's a question mark there is because, as I'm sure many of you know, in the last decade, both in the United States and Europe and many other parts of the world, there's been an explosion of renewables development in the power sector. Tremendous growth in wind energy, onshore, tremendous growth in solar energy worldwide, tremendous growth, as we'll discuss, in European offshore wind, and the question has always been, when will the United States offshore wind market arrive? So that is the subject today, and that's why there's a question mark on ready for takeoff. Just a little plug. So I am an independent consultant in the clean energy and infrastructure space, and certainly if you have any questions for follow-up, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. The U.S. offshore wind market has significant potential. You can see from this map the areas that are the orange and red, particularly in the Northeast and the West Coast, and somewhat in the Great Lakes. There is a lot of just natural wind resource available in the U.S. coastal waters. However, in the Pacific, one of the problems is that the water is very deep, which brings up its own problems with executing and putting in place wind power. But we'll get to that and some innovative solutions that are being evaluated at this time. The Gulf is, the wind resource there is actually quite poor. But you see in the Northeast United States, there's significant wind speed, which means that there's a great potential resource there. On top of that, and as I'm sure many in this room can appreciate, there's a significant macro opportunity. through the Department of Energy, they've identified offshore wind as a significant opportunity space because, as you can see from this chart, and as many of you probably very well know, the decommissioning of nuclear plants and the putting out of service coal facilities, which in fact at this time, this was 2 years ago when these projections were made, coal is still projected to be a significant component of our power mix, although it's fairly clear that that trend is actually accelerating to the negative. But through this DOE analysis, which I said was done in 2016, they concluded that offshore wind would play a significant part in the U.S.'s future generating capacity mix.
Question.
Yes.
Do you know why the renewable share is declining in that model over time?
You know, I think that it's just because I'm not sure, but I think it's because on a relative basis, they saw the tax credits declining, and the yellow area is just this big open space, and without saying it, I think the expectation was that renewables would fill a lot of that. So this was the existing renewables, which run off over time. There are just a couple of more seats.
Sure.
Why don't you come in? You're not interrupting anything.
Sorry to be late here.
Sure. Welcome. Okay, so with the natural resource, the wind resource potential that we have, which we've had for a long time, and we've had significant renewables, onshore wind and solar, we still haven't had offshore wind development, but that is changing. And what we have here is just in the recent past, the last couple of years, several of the Northeast United States have taken the initiative and announced significant offshore wind programs. You can see here the list: New Jersey, New York. These are big amounts. And just for perspective, this table is about 7 gigawatts. A gigawatt can power approximately 700 to 725,000 homes. There are varying estimates, sometimes 600,000, whatever. So if the Northeast offshore wind total installed base comes to 5.5 to 7 megawatts, that can power, it comes to up to 10 megawatts, 10 gigawatts, that can power 5.5 to 7 million homes. So it's a significant additional resource to the generating mix. But as we will see through the course of this discussion, these ambitious plans, which at this stage are only political plans and policy positions, they start from square one as far as, and I can't emphasize this enough, they start from square one in terms of local, professional, technical, and financing expertise, supply chain, which we'll talk about is extremely important, public support, or supporting infrastructure. So we have a lot that has been stated as the public policy goals for offshore wind development, but we are effectively at square one in this process. But I'll put that aside for the moment and just take you through a couple of the particular states' initiatives. New York State, I'm based in New York City, so this is of relevance to me. Governor Cuomo, in January, the state's agency, NYSERDA, New York State Energy Research and Development Agency, for whom I do some consulting, but not on offshore wind. NYSERDA put out its New York State Offshore Wind Master Plan. calling for 2,400 megawatts or 2.4 gigawatts of installed New York State offshore wind by 2030. In Governor Cuomo's State of the State address in January of this year, he highlighted that plan and stated specifically that New York wants 800 megawatts of offshore wind to be contracted within the next year or so and put into service in just a couple of years after that. The NYSERDA Offshore Wind Master Plan went through an extremely rigorous development process. They conducted or had conducted over 20 different independent studies covering everything from environmental impact, economics and supply chain, job creation, public policy, contracting, and so on and so forth. There were a tremendous amount of reach-out sessions around the state through all constituencies, and we'll get back to that in just a moment. The process identified the most favorable locations for development. So what we have here is the general map of New York State potential lease sites. We'll get to costs later. We'll talk about what a offshore wind farm costs. But by way of example, just to give a little hint of how massive the capital required is, you'll see in pretty much the center, a little bit to the left, the green area, the Statoil lease area. That was auctioned, that site was auctioned at the end of 2016 in a public process, and Statoil won it for $42 million. What did the $42 million get Statoil? Simply the rights to develop a wind farm on that site. So with no assurance that they actually will ever be able to develop, permit, finance, construct, and execute on a wind farm. And we'll get to another fact, there is only one operating offshore wind farm in the United States right now. They spent $42 million of entire risk capital just for the rights to develop a site on basically an energy sector that doesn't yet exist in this country. But that goes to the potential. And of course, Statoil didn't simply throw the money away. It's a Norwegian company that has extensive experience in Europe in developing offshore wind farms. We'll get to the European experience in just a couple of moments. So they made a calculated risk, not a completely unreasonable risk. So specifically, the New York area that is being designated for lease auctions for development is this map. It's known as the New York Bight. And these auctions will be set by BOEM in 2019. BOEM is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and it's the key U.S. agency for the entire U.S. offshore wind effort, even though they're working in direct coordination with each of the state jurisdictions. But it's very interesting. I'm sure all of you in this room are very aware of the Trump administration's attitude towards climate change and all things environmental. However, BOEM is part of the Department of Interior, and directly from Secretary Zinke, the Department of Interior through BOEM is extremely bullish and positive on offshore wind development. So it's one little part of the U.S. government that we can all, be very proud of at this stage. I mentioned that in development of the NYSERDA New York State Offshore Wind Master Plan, there was a massive outreach effort to all stakeholders, and I waited until this point to go into a little bit of detail of who the stakeholders are. First of all, this is New York. Just at the top is Long Island. The top left corner is New York Harbor, New Jersey. So you can imagine this is a pretty busy area, busy part of the world for navigation. So as part of the outreach effort, both in developing the master plan and continuing now and intensively going forward, this outreach covers many of the constituencies. It includes fishermen and industry, the fishing related industry, recreational boating and recreational fishing, of course, all sorts of environmental interests, the U.S. Coast Guard and the Navy, aviation. The wind towers are very high, and both commercial and private aviation will be affected. Domestic and international cargo. You can imagine these sea lanes are extremely busy, all funneling up into New York Harbor. So that's an important part, and cruise lines as well. All of the coastal communities, which will certainly be affected, and so on and so forth. So as you can see, even though these wind farms will be way out in the ocean, 20, 30, 40 miles, that really is not empty space like a desert. It's very busy territory. And so the location and designation of the lease areas by BOEM has to be done right, taking into account all of these constituencies, and all of them know that this is coming. So they have their own lobbyists, they have their own public relations departments. I've actually been to many of these meetings where the Fishermen's Association in New Jersey or New York, they have half a dozen people there who are third-party professionals. I'm not saying this critically, I'm just saying this is what it is. All of these groups understand that this is going to happen. All of these groups are intent on ensuring that they do not get harmed, that they get compensation to the extent that that's necessary, but they're all actively involved in this process. It's not going to be easy. Continuing just briefly on some of the other efforts, New Jersey, again, the governor himself, new governor Phil Murphy, when he was inaugurated, talked about offshore wind. There had been a plan developed during the Christie administration, which then went dormant for several years. Murphy said, we're going to get this back on track. And just in mid-September, the New Jersey BPU put out an order for the largest offshore wind solicitation ever in the United States, 1,100 megawatts, and they want to get to 3.5 gigawatts, which is even bigger than New York State's. Massachusetts, again, the governor himself has made pronouncements about offshore wind development. A couple of auctions have already taken place. And so there is already an active offshore wind sector developing in the state of Massachusetts. Rhode Island is very interesting because it is where the first and currently only operating offshore wind facility, deepwater wind, is active at this point. But I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, I mentioned these solicitations. 2,400 megawatts, 3,500 megawatts. New Jersey wants 1,100 megawatts in the next couple of years. The deepwater wind facility in Rhode Island that's operating is 30 megawatts. It's tiny for an offshore wind facility. As we will get to in a few minutes, offshore wind farms are typically 300, 400, 500 megawatts. They're much bigger. But despite its size, it is in operation, so that's a positive. It is saving the ratepayers money, even though it was so expensive. But as you see here, they won their lease in 2013. It took them an additional 3 years of development and construction to get into service. These are very long lead time type of projects. And we'll get to the implications of that in just a couple of minutes. So in addition to the Northeast, which is where we're really focusing at this point, even the Great Lakes, there is some offshore wind activity in development there, and in California as well. I mentioned that the subsurface of the ocean off of the Pacific coast is very deep, so there's one already financed project that's moving forward that's a floating wind farm off of the central coast of California. More to come on that, I hope, in the future. Okay, so again, the U.S. has not really seen a offshore wind market that's been fully realized, but we have just seen that there is certainly a lot of potential natural resource available for wind development, and certainly a lot of political will behind it. As we talked about, the governors themselves are very much in favor of this, some key states. But what really causes optimism is the fully realized precedent of the European offshore wind market and the U.S. onshore wind market. And putting those two together is where I see the market finally taking off. First of all, Europe, as just like the United States, has significant natural wind resources. In particular, the North Sea. I'm sorry, this is kind of a distorted map, but you all know, I'm sure you all know, the European map in any shape or form. You can see the red spots around the UK and over towards Germany and Scandinavia. So the North Sea, the Irish Sea, and the Baltic are areas that have very strong wind potential. And in fact, as we will see, that's where a lot of the wind power, offshore wind power, has been developed. So the European precedent, to date, in particular over the last decade, Europe has put in place 15.8 gigawatts, 15780 megawatts of installed offshore wind capacity. So we have 30 megawatts in the United States now, which is really nothing. The governors of the Northeast states, cumulative, they're looking to put in 5 to 7 gigawatts. Europe is ahead of us already, and they're at 15.8, and they continue to grow. So again, in terms of perspective, 15.8 gigawatts can power about 11 million homes with electricity. You see the accelerating growth, mostly accelerating in the hockey stick on a cumulative basis. So it's been quite successful in Europe with installed capacity, and this is projected to continue. Looking at it country by country, the UK and Germany certainly lead, but on a relative basis, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, these are significant investments proportional to their installed generating base. Europe certainly has been way ahead of the US overall. So I want to make a couple of general observations that underpin the success. The first is, I've stated and given you the rundown of particularly the Northeast states' governors' focus on developing offshore wind as a matter of state policy. In the UK and Germany in particular, it was those countries' specific policies promoting offshore wind development and then putting in place the pieces that enabled implementation. That was the key to success for Europe. And so again, grounds for optimism. We have the states indicating in the Northeast that they intend to do pretty much the same thing. And in a plug for Professor Urpilainen, what's going on, what did go on in Europe and what's going on in the United States fits specifically with his political theory in his recent book on renewables, which I read and I hope you all have read. So I told you I'd give you a plug.
Excellent.
So a couple of other statistics here. So line 5, there are 92 offshore wind farms. Average size is close to 500 megawatts. I keep saying it, in the US we have one farm operating, and it's 30 megawatts. So again, we have a long way to go, but I'm very optimistic about that. Even up to 2017, a robust market, and it is expected to continue. As far as pricing, this is very, very important. As much as the governments of the UK and Germany and other states put in place policies and contracting arrangements that were going to attract and enable the formation of capital and the development risk capital to bring about this huge growth of offshore wind farms. The industry itself has matured, it has evolved, it has become more efficient and competitive. And so while there was, in the beginning, very robust economic support for these projects, the market has gotten extremely competitive and prices are coming down. And what this is leading to is an expectation that in the UK in particular, offshore wind projects are getting very close to being subsidy-free, and in fact will compete with other forms of baseload without subsidies in the very near future. And so, again, taking the precedent of Europe's success, initially supported by government policies, but the competition and the creativity that this engendered has created an industry that is self-sustaining, no longer needs much in the way of subsidies, and soon will be subsidy-free. And so what we will see, certainly in the United States, are regimes that will, at the outset, be very supportive, but the expectation is that, again, because of growth, competition, scaling, efficiency, we will outgrow the need for government support. We're in 2018, almost 2019. It won't happen in the US until the late 2020s. But the precedent, again, of what Europe has gone through is certainly to be expected in the United States. Financing. You can have a sector that requires massive amounts of capital without a deep finance and ready financing market. So what we had in 2017 across 6 projects that reached financial close, 7.5 billion euros, equivalent to over $9 billion in capital put to work. Non-recourse debt is the most prevalent financing instrument. Does anybody here know what non-recourse finance is? Would you like to explain?
Non-recourse finance is basically finance that's sheltered in its own company, and investors in that project are not liable for any risk that may occur if the project, the company itself is investing in underperforms or fails to perform.
Yeah, that's generally correct. Yes.
Yeah, Investopedia, and I know none of this.
Oh, no, that's cheating. That's, no, you're not allowed to do that.
It's solid.
Is that the same as an SPV?
Well, you need an SPV as that's a special purpose vehicle to execute on a project financing. But you're generally right. Non-recourse financing means that you're creating a single asset, in this case, a particular wind farm, and this is the same for an independent gas-fired facility, or in many cases, infrastructure, ports, roads. In this case, a wind farm, however many turbines and structures it is. And those who are investing in that wind farm and lending to that wind farm are providing that on a non-recourse basis to any of the other participants. So if it underperforms or fails, even if Statoil, even if GE, even if a major corporate was involved in the promotion of that project, your recourse as a lender or investor is only to the assets of that enterprise, and not to the GE, not to the NG, not to the NLs of the world who are the sponsors of that non-recourse finance. So that's the most common instrument for infrastructure finance in general, but in the European offshore wind sector. Refinancings hit euros almost 5 billion. So another question to the group. We have these financings, and over many years we've seen several billions of dollars put into these financings. Why do you, if you get something financed, why do you need a refinancing?
Perhaps the cost of financing is decreasing to the point that it would be advantageous to refinance and take advantage of lower rates.
Yes, but why is the cost of financing declining?
I guess as the market becomes more established, then banks are more willing to trust companies with that money, because these projects might have been a little uncertain in the past.
Sort of. What it is at the outset, and we said that in number one, in 2017, 6 projects closed worth 7.5 billion euros. So when you put the initial funding into these projects, they are inherently highly risky. You have not yet constructed it. You have not yet gotten to the end of construction and into operations. You have not, despite all of your wind studies, you haven't generated any wind power, you haven't generated any money. So there's a lot of risk there. But over time, and so the lenders and investors who put in that money on day one are pricing in all of those risks. They are comfortable, they understand the risks, and there will be mitigants, but you still are investing into an inherently risky enterprise on a non-recourse basis. You get through construction, hopefully on time and within budget. And so then you get into your first couple of months, first couple of years of operations, and all those reams and reams of studies of meteorological data and the performance of your wind turbines and everything else, all of that actually materializes as expected. But again, on day one, all you had was a stack of contracts and a big plot of very inhospitable ocean territory to start the enterprise. Now you're 5 years later, gone through construction, you're generating revenues, the contracts all work, and you're making money as expected. Well, at that point, the risk has significantly gone down, and so as an original investor, you have the ability to refinance the project. Let's say the original financing was at a credit spread of 400 basis points. Maybe you can now refinance at 200 basis points and save that margin and pocket that money as an investor. Or as an original investor, you put in your money expecting a significant return based on the risk you're taking on day one with nothing really in the ground. After this, you have effectively proof of concept. You as an equity holder can sell to an institution who now sees the steady performance and would accept a lower return. So that's why the refinancing market is also an important indicator of how successfully executed the European offshore wind market is.
The projects are defined solely in terms of the turbines and the foundation, so does that include the line to the ground and the grid that is attached to? Or what do you define as the project?
So in different countries, there are different regimes. What this gentleman is referring to are the assets of the wind farm itself and then the connection to shore. There are different regimes in Europe where the state will provide the transmission from your wind farm. You get it built, you get it up and running, we'll connect you to land. In other jurisdictions, you have to include that cost into your enterprise, and so the definition of the project will either be to the transmission line or to shore, but it's known. And in the United States, it's again, as I was saying, we're at square one. This very crucial threshold question of whether the state or the individual projects will get their power to shore has not yet been settled in any particular state. So again, we have a long way to go to settle a lot of very important issues, but everything's poised.
There's no
to
state
settle.
or federal government owns transmission in the United States.
Say that again?
The government doesn't own any transmission in the United States.
Well, they're in the on land. You have the RTOs, the regional transmission organizations, and
They're
and
the operator
ISOs.
rather than the owner.
Right. They're operators. Nobody who owns whether it's a solar plant or an onshore wind farm or a cogeneration plant, none of those generating assets own the transmission line. We have distribution companies and transmission companies. But for offshore, it's an entirely open question of who's going to do that. Will it be the state, will it be the individuals, or will the state contract for an individual company, a private company, to be the transmission backbone? That hasn't been settled yet. I see I'm already taking up a lot of time, so I will move along here. So, supply chain. I mentioned that the U.S. is at square one. In addition to the natural resources and the political will, and hopefully the financing capability, you also need a supply chain. And in the United States, well, first of all, Europe has a robust supply chain. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but there are turbine manufacturers. The U.S. has a robust supply chain. Civil engineering, in particular the foundations to put these turbines, to support them down to the ocean floor. The cables, the wind farms themselves have sometimes 20, 30, 40 foundations and turbine sets. They all have to be connected within the wind farm itself to a controller. And then export cables leading to land, as we've just been discussing. So all of that needs to be developed for the U.S. supply chain. As I said, in the U.S. we have turbine manufacturers for onshore wind. We have a lot of expertise on the civil side because of our oil and gas, offshore oil and gas industry, but we don't necessarily have the offshore wind cables, the offshore wind foundations, or the offshore wind transmission equipment. But all those who are actively getting involved in the industry know that all of these things have to happen. My point is that again, there is precedent, but at the US level, we're starting from square one. The last part of this sector is innovation. There is a tremendous amount of innovation within the European offshore wind sector. By the way, I mentioned Europe and the US. Hopefully, we're poised to take off. But in Asia, Asia has leapfrogged the United States from virtually nothing about 3 years ago. There are significant wind farm developments off of China, off of Japan, Taiwan. It has really accelerated in just the last couple of years. Turbine size is increasing. The average size, the installed base in Europe today is 5.9 megawatts per turbine. GE is in development. They've announced they hope to have a 12 megawatt turbine. This is really important because offshore wind farms are so expensive. So to the extent that the manufacturers can come up with larger turbines, which are produce relatively higher amounts per blade of energy and are relatively cheaper per megawatt of cost, these could have significant positive impacts on the economics in the U.S. Let's see. One other just very important concept you see in point 3, overall cost reductions. McKinsey has projected that the costs on an LCOE basis, does anybody know what LCOE means?
Levelized cost of energy.
Well, since you know what it is, will you explain to us what it is?
It's kind of a basket of different factors included to kind of look at the life cycle cost of energy. So not the sort of day one operating cost, but includes a lot of the financing costs, operation O&M, to kind of give a more long-term look at the cost of a given project or given source.
Right. It's LCOE stands for levelized cost of energy, and it is a life cycle view on any energy generating technology. So something like offshore wind or nuclear has extremely high upfront capital costs, but wind, nuclear have virtually zero operating costs, whereas a coal-fired or a natural gas plant has a relatively mid-level capital cost up front, but of course you have to pay for your gas, you have to pay for your coal, you have a lot more moving parts. And so factoring in all of those upfront costs and all of those operating costs over the life cycle of a particular technology gives you the LCOE. And European wind, as I was saying, they're now getting to the point of being competitive with baseload generating. This is all measured, the metric is LCOE. So it's important for you guys just in general to understand that concept. Okay, so public benefits, they are numerous. I've just listed a couple here, but in particular, from a political perspective, it is a win-win for the governors to say, we are going to promote offshore wind. It's clean, reliable, renewable energy, and it's going to create tons of jobs. I mean, that's the beginning, middle, and end of a politician's speech. So it's great for them. Additional benefits are that, as we've seen from the European example, offshore wind is becoming cost competitive. It's an economic stimulus. This point about contribution to grid modernization is very important. And in particular, one positive element in Northeast offshore wind that Europe doesn't have is that, as we saw from the map, the primary offshore wind development will be in the Northeast near the load centers. You develop off of Long Island, you're very close to New York, New Jersey, that's where the population is. In the North Sea, in the Baltic Sea, there's a tremendous additional cost, not only of bringing the power to land, but then bringing it effectively to the population centers. So for the US, this won't create a big tax on existing onshore distribution. It will in fact enhance it because it's new load going right into the most important load pockets.
Although if you already have an established grid, the fact that you're on the periphery of the grid, does it make that much? Do you lose that much from being on the periphery of the grid rather than the middle, rather than being at the load center?
Yeah, because if you're, just think of, let's say, Paris, bringing offshore wind to Paris. Paris is the center. The grid probably doesn't have a lot of high voltage distribution from 50 miles away or 100 miles away bringing power into Paris. So now you put offshore wind off the coast, big volumes. How do you get it to Paris? You probably have to build some high tension distribution wires to do that. For US offshore wind, for New York, you just have to get it to land, basically.
But certainly New York gets a lot of its power from upstate. New York City gets a lot of its power from upstate. So and having lived in Westchester, you can see it a lot. There's a fair amount of power being moved around already. I suspect France also. Paris gets a lot. France has a lot of nuclear power, and most of it's not around Paris directly, but a bit further away. Well, anyway, I don't know.
Okay. So let's get to per project economics. So everything about offshore wind other than our one existing 30 megawatt plant, is big. And it's expensive in terms of time and money, and certainly in terms of risk. What I've listed here is the development itself can take 3 to 4 years, can cost up to $200 million. So that's money that's spent, that's going out over 3 or 4 years before you ever get to full financing, full project contracting, full permits. This is money that's going to get you all of those things, but it's before you actually even get into construction. So it's very risky, very high cost, this is high risk capital that goes into this. I'm sorry, okay. So what I wanted to do is show you an indicative pro forma for a summary sheet for an offshore wind project. And I just want to point out a couple of things. So the first top left, project size 400 megawatts. This is much more indicative of the size of projects that we're going to see. Line 7, development costs, $193 million. So $200 million, as I just explained, that's before you ever get to a financial close, before you ever get anything in the ground. And on top of spending that $193 million, you have to raise money for the turbines, the rest of the system, that's the foundation, the civil work, the cable, all of the labor, and the financial cost. There's a tremendous amount of financing that goes on. Your cost of capital is extremely high to execute on an offshore wind farm. How do you finance it? Go down to lines 13 and 14. On an indicative basis, approximately 70% would be from non-recourse debt, and another 30% would be from equity, or about $1.3 billion of debt and $550 million of equity. It's a lot of money. I've been involved in very large transactions. That's a lot of money to raise, and this is very, very high-risk capital on the front end. On the top right, line 34, PPA term. Does anybody know what a PPA is? Power purchase agreement. That's what gives you the revenue certainty. For anybody to commit the $1.9, the $2 billion of capital, they need to know that there's revenue certainty, and that comes in the form of a power purchase agreement that's coming from these various states' public utility commission proceedings. Revenue. So, assuming that we get through construction, these things generate a lot of money, $250 million a year. What's really interesting, and this goes to the LCOE discussion, $250 million of revenues, our yearly operating costs projected at about $34 million, less than 10% of your revenues. Wow, these things must really mint money. But because it takes so much capital, your annual debt service is $140 million. You have to pay off the debt. Hopefully you are turning a profit, cash flow, positive cash flow, and you make $70 million of distributions to equity, which is a lot of money, but it goes against $550 million of equity raised. So it's not a slam dunk. This project, as we projected it out, gives a reasonable return on the investment of the equity, hopefully up to a 20% equity IRR, but that's probably being extremely optimistic. Two terms I want to make sure you understand. Line 40, EBITDA. Does everybody know what that is? Earnings before interest, tax, and amortization. So that's your cash flow. So I said the revenue is $250, yearly cost is $34. That's your operating revenues, your operating costs, your operating cash flow, or EBITDA, is $213 million. Second thing, debt service coverage ratio, down at the bottom, lines 56 through 58. Does everybody understand what debt service coverage ratio is? It's your annual cash flow of $213 million over your debt service of 140 million in year one. And that is the debt service coverage ratio. And lenders will project out over the term of their debt the ability of the project to generate EBITDA or operating cash flow to service their debt, which is expressed in the debt service coverage ratio. These are all estimates, so don't ever hold me to it. I've talked a lot about the risks. For all of these risks to go into this, you have to assess what the mitigants are. Nobody ever takes risks that are completely unmitigated, or at least not in the financing world, commercial world. So it's a nascent industry, as I mentioned, but the precedents of European offshore wind, not only the precedent, but the successful precedent of European offshore wind and the United States onshore experience gives me a lot of confidence. Risk B, the revenue construct has not been settled. No state yet has fully settled what the revenue basis will be, what that PPA will look like for the developers of these offshore wind farms. Statoil spent $40 million for their lease in New York. That was in 2016. The master plan didn't come out until 2018. But again, because of their experience, they are anticipating that for the state to actually follow through on wanting 2.4 gigawatts of power developed, the state will in fact develop a contract regime that will be able to attract the capital to build 2.5 gigawatts of power.
Question.
Long development cycle, high capital costs, established supply chain. We've discussed all of these.
A quick question.
Yes.
Why would a PPA for an offshore wind project be significantly different than a PPA for any other really big renewable project or even conventional energy project?
Well, because for a variety of reasons. First of all, the wind resource, the capital costs are significantly higher. We haven't settled the transmission issue, so what should the developer get for the asset? Should it include recovery of costs for the transmission, or is that going to be somebody else? So it's almost chicken and egg. Anticipate also simply learning. We have gone through PPAs in the United States for various technologies in many different jurisdictions for the past 30, 40 years. And so now taking it to an entirely new sector, energy sector, but applying those things that worked and those things that didn't work in the past. Also looking at Europe. Europe has evolved and they have a variety of different regimes, contract for differences, minimums, collars, all sorts of things. So that is my presentation. I've given you a list of acronyms because it is kind of crazy, and as well some additional places to go for resources. So thank you for listening. Any additional questions, I'd be happy to ask them.
Thank you.
So before I let the audience grill you about the details, I want to ask two questions. The first one is, so you mentioned in the beginning that there is a significant macro opportunity here, but do you have a sense of, looking at the big spread, the yellow in the chart in the beginning, how big is really the opportunity for offshore wind in particular? In Europe, it's a no-brainer because onshore wind is in serious trouble. There are very few places where you can build, but the US still has plenty of land available with good wind conditions. So how big is the case for offshore wind at the macro level, and why do we need it here?
Let me answer the second question first. Why do we need it? Because we do need more capacity, and this is a new area that with the resource, it is a no-brainer for these states with in these jurisdictions with the adequate wind resource. And the ability to add 10, 15, maybe 20 gigawatts on the Northeast to the supply stack is a significant opportunity. Plus, it is clean energy. As I mentioned, for the politicians, it's the two significant positives of its clean energy, and it creates jobs. So those are very important. As to the full depth of the opportunity, I actually don't know.
But so just following up on that, so it seems a lot of this is driven by regional or state-by-state considerations.
Definitely, state by state. Yeah.
But I think this is a very important point here, is that US as a whole, there's plenty of space for additional onshore wind, solar and all that, but in these states, New York and so on, there is population densities are higher, the resource for solar is weaker, and so on, so that's where you see this opportunity.
Yeah, and in New York in particular, which I know the best, I was talking about how the offshore wind is close to the load pocket, New York City and the metropolitan area, and we were talking a little bit about transmission. Well, it is certainly not at all for sure that additional capacity can come from Canada or upstate New York and make it to New York City. New York City is transmission constrained currently. There have been ideas for as long as I've been in the power business for new transmission lines or expanded transmission lines, bringing very cheap Ontario hydropower to New York City, but nobody's been able to do that. There's a lot of political opposition, and so for the state and New York City to see this resource out in the ocean very close by, that leaves Canada out of it, that leaves Albany out of it, that leaves Westchester County out of it, it's quite a compelling argument.
So the second question I have is, you also talked briefly about load management. So how does the load profile look like for offshore wind, especially in compared to onshore wind? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, in general, I'm a commercial and finance guy. I'm certainly not a weatherman, but in general, offshore wind blows more during the day than onshore wind, which, as many of you probably know, blows mostly at night. So from a load management perspective, if you have this resource close by that's generating during the day, you're getting not a 100% base load reliable peak period resource, but you're getting a lot of juice during the day.
And that is very important because the renewable energy integration costs tend to increase with capacity and use. And if you have something that's inversely correlated with onshore wind, which is a key resource right now, then that is very useful for the system as a whole. Those were my questions. Let's now see what we have from the audience.
Yes.
So hi, I'm Theo. I was recently in BP's Chicago office, and they were talking about their wind sites, and they have 15 onshore and 1 off, and that's co-operated off of Hawaii. So I was curious if you could speak to more of, like, who do you think from the private domestic side is going to invest in this? Because Statoil is like a Norwegian subsidiary. Siemens makes probably arguably the best turbines. So, like, where do you see the domestic impetus coming from a private perspective?
Well, that's a good question. So far, in my my own experience, the U.S., particularly the Northeast, is still going to be dominated by the European offshore wind developers. There have not been any that I'm aware of American onshore wind developers who are there, some of whom are hugely successful development companies. I haven't seen any of them express an interest in getting into offshore wind, nor have I seen any of the large, well-capitalized, independent power, conventional energy developers, or private equity funds. And this goes back to the issue of development capital, that $200 million, that $40 million that Statoil invested. That is such a huge number and such a huge risk in the minds of commercial and financial guys that it's only the corporates who have done it in Europe who are prepared at this stage to do that in the US. So right now, it's only Don, it's only Statoil, it's only Avangrid, Copenhagen Partners, it's the Europeans. And I've mentioned this to a variety of state officials that we want to promote all of this local stuff, but the actual developers are all foreigners. And in the current DC climate, I think that's going to be a problem at some point. Good question. Yes, Professor Cole.
We had a number of years of controversy about offshore Cape Cod.
Yes.
Has that been resolved in any kind of positive way? And is Cape Cod a desirable location?
Yes, so that was the Cape Wind project, which has been officially terminated. It was simply years ahead of its time. Terrible controversy. It was too close to shore. The Kennedys opposed it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is a new project off of Martha's Vineyard that's in active development that won a power purchase agreement through the state, also European developers. But it's farther out, and I think people just realize that if you look at the facts, leaving aside the other issues such as the commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, aviation, but just talk about the impact to those on the shore, it's a non-issue. Yes?
Could you help me understand the difference between the federal ocean management? So the BOM is doing most of the leasing because it's sufficiently offshore that it would fall outside of the state jurisdiction. But in that case, how did the states actually meaningfully implement these targets?
They have to work in coordination. BOEM only will work to lease this area when effectively they're requested by the state, because it's a whole package over time. For example, I mentioned that Statoil won that auction in 2016. We didn't have the master plan until this year, and we don't have a contracting regime. But Statoil invested early, knowing that it will come, and knowing that they have the time to wait. But BOEM didn't just say, hey, we want to lease New York or any other state's waters for potential wind development. It had to be with the expectation that the state, once BOEM gives the lease, the state will put in place all of the things that you need to actually build the thing. Permitting, contract regime, transmission to shore, all of that is primarily driven by the state.
And State Utility Commission would have to approve impact on ratepayers.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to, but yes. Yeah.
So when you spoke about some of the risks inherent to these capital intensive projects, especially up front, do you know if they're primarily leveraging the ITC or looking at the PTC, because higher production might be low leverage?
Neither one, because for the most, Deepwater Wind in service in 2016 got ITC, I believe. I'm pretty sure. But there won't be any other projects. I don't believe there will be any other projects that will come into service to qualify for either of those.
They can't get early consideration for having started?
It's possible. The one on Long Island may, but for the most part, let's just call it 90% of what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Tax credits are not part of the equation.
They work without tax credit, that's not necessarily a problem.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah.
Cool.
But again, that's why without the tax credit, the state utility commissions will have to factor in what are the economics. And if there's not the ability for equity to monetize 30% of X, Y, and Z, but it still has to return a certain competitive distributions to equity, then you have to factor that in on increasing the revenue side. There's no free lunch.
Yeah, no doubt, that's great.
Yes.
Can you comment on, I just want to mention a couple of things and see, because I'm thinking that they probably haven't heard about this. Can you talk about, when you talk about renewables coming onto the grid, what you notice is the wholesale prices start dropping. So you're right, they become very cheap, and in fact, they go negative in a lot of places. The retail prices, on the other hand, accelerate. So how is it possible that the wholesale price can be essentially zip and in fact negative, but the retail price isn't? I mean, I know the answer, I'm sure you do also.
You give me more credit, but I'm not particularly strong in rates, but I do know that those are two very different things. Retail rates don't vary like wholesale rates do, so you can have the rates periodically go down and go to zero, but that won't necessarily be translated into free electrons at the retail level.
That's not what's happening there. And I just wanted two things. So that's one thing, and
But I did say this was not my strong suit, but...
Well, but I think it's an important thing when you're talking about renewables. Maybe you know what I'm talking about there. And also there's a big issue, there's much discussion about whether levelized cost of energy is an appropriate figure of merit for renewables, which are inherently intermittent. And so you have the sort of the question, which is, it's quite easy to drown in a pond with an average depth of 1 inch. I mean, if you think about it, you can do that. It's not hard. And there is an argument to say that levelized cost of energy, it works for financial in the same sense as just like ninja loans worked in the bank crisis, which is you could monetize it and you could sell it, but in the real world there isn't energy behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And
no, that's very true. And in fact, things like U.S. wind power, because they are, for example, in places like Iowa and Texas, those wind farms are located very far away from the load centers, and the LCOE does not include the cost of transmission. So there are some weaknesses to the LCOE metric. I can tell you that the Lazard Investment Bank that does the LCO, they basically have set the standard for the annual analysis of LCOE, and they do it across all generating technologies. They do not do a U.S. offshore wind LCOE. It doesn't exist yet because there is no industry yet.
I think the Northeast are going to be very high power regions, so that delivered power is going to come in below whatever the LP is in those areas.
I mean, I'm just asking, do you understand how it's possible to have essentially zipped wholesale price because you have lots of renewables, but your retail price is going to be huge, which in fact, every place with, it's a uniform, if we do a graph of percentage of renewables on your grid, the highest prices, the highest retail prices are always the places that have the most renewables.
Could I might be able to take this one. Although you have instances where you have negative power pricing, that's not the sort of standard across the whole year or month of power pricing. A retail price is set by the Utility Commission based on a formula that is determined by what effectively your average wholesale price across the year.
That's not what's happening though.
That is correct. That is how a Utility Commission would set its rates for customers.
But that's not how I mean, my background is engineering, and that's part of the reason I came. I'm guessing you guys aren't hearing what happens in the practical world out there. What you're saying, all the kind of stuff, the money stuff you're saying, that makes sense to a bank in the sense of ninja kind of loans. It really is, the economics works out. What is happening, and how do you get zero and negative wholesale prices? The answer is you can't put electricity on a shelf. You have to price it instantaneously. Every single wind farm within hundreds of miles of wherever you're using the electricity, they all generate the power at the same moment. Every single solar plant, the sunlight comes at the same time. And so what happens is, no matter how many you build and no matter where you put them, they all generate the power at the same moment, supply and demand. The more power you get, the wholesale price goes down to zip. Now, why doesn't the retail price go to zip? In every other industry, if the wholesale price goes to
Retail is
zero.
not instantaneous.
I'm sorry?
Retail price is determined usually on an annual basis.
No.
But also,
In the
in what
electricity
region are we
market,
running
it's instantaneous.
100% off of
That's
renewables?
incorrect.
There's no region where we're running 100% off renewables, so the wholesale price of electricity is never gonna be zero
You know,
anyway.
and there's future markets that are by the, 1 minute and 6 minute increment, 15-minute increments.
But retail price is decoupled. There's retail price is determined by the utility.
Oh,
commission.
right, yeah, the retail price is the average one. That's the average depth of a pond. Yes, you're right. In most cases, that's why utilities are pushing for, not utilities, many regulatory outfits are pushing for time-of-day prices. They want the retail price to be sensitive to supply and demand.
I don't know if consumers want that. though.
No, consumers, nobody wants it, because you don't want to think
Well,
about
industrial
when you run the
consumer
grind.
might, but for the most part.
Industrial, yeah. Anyway, I think we're veering to an aspect that's a very important topic, but it's not on the topic of offshore wind. And I think other people have some questions.
Yeah, let's take a few more questions.
Yes.
I was wondering if there is, like, if you see any development in the infrastructure pertaining to wind energy in general, or if it's, or if like this power source will just add to the existing grid that we have right now. Like, is there going to be any more development? Like, I'm sorry, like, would it just add to the existing infrastructure, or do you like foresee any more development in, never mind, I'm sorry.
Some transmission infrastructure to get the power to land?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
subsea cables and stuff?
Yeah.
Well, that you definitely need. As I said, we're starting from square one, so you need everything. And we were talking about you need cables across the wind farm itself from turbine to turbine, foundation to foundation, and then you have to aggregate that through a controller and then get it to land, and then you'll need a substation to take that massive amount of power in and step it down and put it into the existing grid, and the existing grid may need enhancements as well. All of that's still TBD.
Let's take one more question.
I have a much less heady question here. I know your expertise is in Long Island and New York and the Northeast in general, but what about, I know Virginia, Governor Northam just came out with a big plan. He's obviously trying to step up there and be included with New Jersey and New York. We also have North Carolina. I know there's a wind moratorium until the beginning of this year, which I'm kind of hoping that falls off. And a final thing, Statoil is looking at leases down there in U.S. Wind, a small firm in Baltimore.
Yeah, it's owned by an Italian company.
Yeah, so that kind of goes into what you were saying about, international, not really a U.S. firm. But anything you can say about those leases? I know Bones had them up for a while, or anything else here?
It's impossible to cover everything,
Right.
but yes, I know Virginia is very pro. I'm not familiar with North Carolina. I'm sure the recent experience off of the coast might put a chill in development. All of the states, Maryland has, I think the U.S. Wind is a Maryland-based project. It's all there. It's all good.
Okay, so Maryland's going to be fine. They've been pushed back by the Ocean City Council from 11.
Oh, I'm not talking specifically. I'm just saying that all up and down from Virginia, there was North Carolina, but all the way across the coast. I just didn't talk about each state.
Right.
That was simply, in the interest of time, not to exclude anybody.
Understood. Thanks.
Very quickly, yes.
In the case of New York State in particular, would a potential overturning of the fracking ban impact the viability of offshore wind?
I don't think so. New York is going to be constrained, and the fracking ban has had its own implications, and it's affected development of conventional gas combined cycle plants. But New York State will have load growth and needs increased capacity, period.
All right, fantastic. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you very much.